I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here, and thank the members of the working group for all the effort that's been put in, all the time that you all have spent with us and you and your staffs. We've really enjoyed our engagement here in West Virginia. It's quite a privilege to get to do this work, and we really appreciate all that you've done to make us both feel welcome and get the information that we need. I want to reintroduce the members of our team. We've got Mark Pelka here as a newcomer to our team and since December, Megan Grosso, who everyone knows, Ed Wackerly, who works with me in Austin, does the data analysis, and Jason Cartman over here. Let me advance the slide, if it works. Want to give a shout out to our funders, without whose support we would not be able to be here. Lindsay Carlson is here from Pew. Lindsay, thanks for being here. And I also wanted to note for the members of the working group and perhaps others that we've got a team here from the Urban Institute in DC. My old friend Nancy Lavine, Helen Ho, and Debbie Mayer are here. They're doing an assessment of justice reinvestment, so they're going to be talking with many of you in an effort to help us make this process even better. Hopefully it's good now, but even better than it is. So we'd appreciate your cooperation with them. I like to think of the 650,000 records analyzed. That's the Ed department. All those meetings, all the 100 meetings, that in-person meetings, that's Megan and Jason. To some extent myself, to some extent Mark, but that's a lot of work in and of itself. And by the way, that only means meetings that we set up, so that when we were with Vivian, for example, out at the racetrack in easternmost West Virginia, that's not a meeting that's counted on this. So we had a lot of contact with a lot of people all across the state, and really feel like we got some great information from you all. Of course, the last part, this is the fourth and final working group meeting. That's where I get to do this part. And I really must say that for me, it is a privilege, because these other guys on this team do so much work in support of this effort that it makes my job quite a bit easier. And it lets me, kind of parachute in and do the work of trying to explain the information that they've done such a great job developing. So I really appreciate that. I have a goofy question to ask. Is anybody here in a new relationship? Is anybody just getting to know somebody special in their life? My guess is there might not be anybody in this particular demographic in that position that are willing to admit it, exactly. But the reason I ask is that, we've all been through that. We've all had that sort of giddy, literally drug-induced state that we get in as humans when we're first getting to know somebody. And it sounds kind of weird, but that's what this process has been like for me. It's like, how you just think of, well, what would Bobby Sue think of this? How would she react to that? It's that same kind of thing where you are constantly in work and in life encountering things, learning things, and thinking, what would Joe Thornton think about that? How would this play out in West Virginia? Who needs to know about this in West Virginia? There's this constant, it's just in your mind all the time. So and I think that's probably true for the whole team, but it certainly has been true for me, to just be immersed in your state. It's really quite an extraordinary experience, and I just want to thank you all for supporting us in doing that. The first part will just be a quick trip through about 7 or 8 slides that we've shown you before, just to make a few key points that kind of lead into the second part in terms of the policy framework, where we'll spend the most time. And then in the third portion, we'll talk about the impact of the policies and how we think we can achieve some savings. This sums up a number of different points that we wanted to make about the impact of drugs and substance abuse on your criminal justice system. We heard about that topic, drugs, substance abuse, the sea of addiction, as one person put it, virtually at every turn in this state. So we really want to bring that out and highlight it. The first bullet and the third bullet here have to do with new commitments and stock population in the prison system, a growing proportion of people coming in with drug offenses, not necessarily in need of treatment with that particular offense, but certainly some crossover there. And then the second and third bullets speak to the issue of revocation, which we've addressed quite a bit. That a high percentage of your probation revocations are coming in with a high indication of need for substance abuse treatment. And when we looked at parole revocations, where we were able to look in great detail at the paperwork around revocations, we saw substance abuse cited 3 out of 4 times in revocation events of any type. So the substance abuse is really a driver both of new commitments and of revocations. Now, arrests for drug offenses are only up 6%. I think that's actually kind of an interesting figure. You might think that means, well, what are we so worried about? I actually suspect that without any real foundation, but that may be a feature of suppressed demand. There may be, from everything we've heard, there is so severe a problem here that I wonder whether law enforcement itself is holding back a little bit on people with substance abuse offenses. Prison commitments are increasingly property and drug offenders. We showed you this, I think, back in September. Pretty high percentage increases in both of those categories. And, again, the point here is that we think that there are populations growing in your system that may be susceptible to some changes in policy. I think when I showed this last time, I think it was Philip that said, well, but these people are probably repeat offenders. They're people that we've really gotten frustrated with. They're probably people who have substance abuse problems. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. So we showed this as well, I think, back in September. We've got revocations on top of, pretty good increase in new commitments. We've got revocations from all categories of community corrections in the state, probation, community corrections, and parole, going up. Pretty good numbers in all categories mounting, and revocations are definitely a driver in your system, and we want to attack that with some policy options. And then turning to the back end of the system, this we showed you before as well. This is the increase in both the quantity and the proportion of people who are maxing out, getting out of prison without any supervision whatsoever. We want to address that. We talked a bit about the parole grant rate, and this is a way of depicting the grant rate that takes into account the growing problem of further considerations, FCs, and illustrates that if you count those into the mix, your grant rate is at 33%, where it was 42% some years back. If you take the FCs out and think of it a different way, that it makes the grant rate look higher. But the point here is that in terms of the productivity of the parole process for purposes of your bed population, their grant rate has decreased. And also on the FC topic, we showed you previously that quite a few, three-fourths of FCs are driven by home plan issues, some in combination with the psych eval issue, the delays in getting psych evaluations done. And we'll talk about both those things a little bit more in the policy options. This set of points is really some issues that, kind of going back to my own personal experience with being in West Virginia, these are things that really resonated for me, and I wanted to talk about them a little bit. These are 3 challenges that are kind of unique to West Virginia, and I want to in part just reflect back to you all that we heard about these things, that we understand that you all said these things to us and we heard them. They're not all things we can do anything about. We can't help you with your convoluted geographic terrain. I love flying into West Virginia and seeing it. It's a beautiful sight, but it causes its own problems. I think the very first time we talked to Steve Canterbury, he told us about the uniqueness of the terrain and how it creates these tiny communities all across the state that are somewhat disconnected from each other and creates transportation problems in delivering services, and so forth. So that's something that we have to always keep in mind as we try to implement changes in the state, something that's just a reality that you all live with and that we've come to know. The first point there goes back to something I think I said in June when we first spoke. I told you that we wanted to focus on 6 different areas, and most of them had to do with data. But one of them, if you'll remember, was I wanted to learn more about the connection between your criminal justice system and your behavioral health system and the collaboration that might exist there. And what I think I learned is that there isn't much of a connection, and there isn't a whole lot of collaboration. And that's a real challenge that we're going to be talking with you about today and in the months to come in terms of how we implement a reinvestment strategy that gets money into treatment in the criminal justice system. So that's something that a challenge that we do want to talk about how to address and help you brainstorm how to do that. And then finally, there's the structural challenge of the way that your adult system is set up. You have 5 different agencies at the state level, all represented here today by great folks that all deal in adult corrections. You have at least 4 options, maybe more, at the local level, 4 different programs that are available to judges as sentencing options. Judges are only connected to one of those programs, formally connected through probation. So you have a lot of challenges of reaching across organizational boundaries, reaching across information silos. We've got to make sure that your structure, which we're not proposing to change, but which we recognize as an issue and a challenge, we've got to make sure that your structure doesn't mean that things like getting some kind of programming in the regional jails. We've got to make sure that the fact that there happen to be 2 different corrections agencies in your state, that's not a barrier to getting treatment to people, getting programs to people in regional jails. There are other more real barriers, and there are things that we have to overcome, but we don't want the structural realities to be just outright barriers to getting what needs to be accomplished done. The single most important slide in the pack today sums up what we're here to talk about. We have developed a policy framework that creates a new era of investment in drug treatment and effective supervision so that offenders are held accountable and public safety is increased. This framework hits on the 3 key problems that we found in looking around West Virginia and will end the unchecked growth of your prison population with a new era, as I say, of stronger supervision, strengthened supervision, and an investment in drug treatment that will but that will reduce recidivism. So if you're following along in the paper or wanting to follow along in the paper, I have to tell you that I've reversed the order a little bit. In the paper, the last thing here, strengthening community supervision, is the first topic that's addressed in the paper, and the third topic, drugs treatment, is the third topic in the paper. If you just read the paper, I think that you would find the logic and the flow very, very logical and compelling. I think that works quite well in the paper. Personally, speaking to this group and having heard so much about the substance abuse problems in the state, I felt uncomfortable taking that approach in the presentation. So I wanted to start right off and hit the drug treatment issues right away because I felt like this audience in particular would be waiting and not really listening until I got to that point. So I wanted to hit that right away. So I apologize if that messes you up in terms of looking through the document, but I think that it'll work better. It'll work better this way for now. Before I get to the punchline, a couple of reminders. We talked about this before. We all recognize that that drug treatment can be most effective if it's done right and done in conjunction with effective supervision. It can be very well done and very effectively done in terms of reducing recidivism in the community. So in-prison treatment isn't the only option. And we also recognize that there needs to be a continuum of treatment, that not all people need the same thing. Some people can have a drug problem and either move through life unaffected, or they can go to AA or NA and that's what they need and they'll get by with that. Other people need more and more intensive levels of treatment on down into residential RSAT, residential programs. So we all recognize that, and we just want to remind you that that is a reality here and everywhere, and as we talk about the way that we'd like to structure the reinvestment. You remember the top half of this slide. We talked about this, I think, in December, and we pointed out that while you have these 427 RSAT slots in your prison system, you don't have any money invested in drug treatment for people on probation or on parole. There is some funding through the day report centers, but we don't have a very clear picture of how that funding translates into treatment, so we left that as unknown treatment capacity. So the basic idea here is to invest in the 2 areas that are unfunded right now, probation and parole. And what we want to do to spur that investment, first of all, when we get to the policy options, we'll talk about how we create the savings that will hopefully allow that investment. But in terms of the long run, we want to propose a new treatment sentencing, a treatment supervision sentence that will give judges an alternative that they know will result in treatment. You know, it's when you send someone to jail or you send someone to prison, you know somebody's picking up the tab. The state's paying for the prison bed, they're paying for health care, they're paying for all the things that go along with prison. But in West Virginia, when you have put someone on probation, you haven't had any reassurance that there's going to be an ability to treat someone for substance abuse. And we want to set the stage through this reinvestment for a treatment supervision sentence that would go into effect a couple years from now, so that there can be a build-up to having that kind of treatment infrastructure in place. As I said, we want to reinvest the funding into probation and parole as the key parts of the system that are not getting any funding for treatment now, and where we really see the need to strengthen the way you do business. And in conjunction with that, we have to suggest the kind of sort of boring aspect of, you know, building up the workforce, making sure that the people who are in probation and parole and day report centers in particular understand how to use risk and need and understand how to do their jobs in a way that will have the most effect on recidivism and on correcting people's behavior. So we are going to recommend a pretty good investment in those sorts of issues. And what this slide demonstrates is that $5 million would go a long way, but not all the way, even based on the assumptions that we made, which some of you may challenge. So we made a series of simplifying assumptions to arrive at this figure of $6.8 million is what we think would really be needed to address the substance abuse treatment issues in your probation and parole system. So at our last meeting, I described to you the way that we guesstimated the number of people on probation and parole who need drug treatment. And I'm not going to go through that same set of assumptions now, but we did talk about that. I'd be happy to elaborate if someone's troubled by it. We came up with these numbers in that middle column, estimated probation parole population. That total of 1,942 people who need treatment in those areas. Then we also applied an assumption that talked about the kind of treatment that they would need: outpatient, intensive outpatient, residential. And we applied percentages to that 1942 to get those numbers that you see. So there's some simplifying assumptions here. And another set of assumptions that were applied from some national, very recent study that was done around the cost of providing drug treatment of different sorts. So we've taken the mid-range of cost estimates and applied that mid-range number in these three rows to end up with that total of 6.8 million almost. So that's what conservatively we think is really needed to address drug treatment issues across an array of different types of treatment, including residential, in your community corrections, your probation and parole populations. We want to try to overcome some structural barriers by basically telling people you got to work together, you've got to come together. You've got to get behavioral health providers involved in community corrections, and I know that's a tall order, and we really need to have justice and community services being more aggressive than they have been about looking at who's on these councils at the local level, these committees, making sure that all the appropriate viewpoints and perspectives are represented, and kind of riding herd a little bit more. We've talked a little bit about how they have not been, how the effort has been to sell the notion of community corrections and day report centers, and that I think a lot of people are in agreement that it's time to kind of ramp up the rigor with which those are operated. So this is in pursuit of that objective. We do want to make sure that the in-prison program is targeted at the people that really need it the most, the high-risk, high-need people that need substance abuse treatment more than anybody else. I mean, the other people may need it, but for your purposes and with your limited resources, you want to make sure that that's very closely, appropriately targeted. Linked with that, we need to make sure that disagreements between the Department of Corrections, Division of Corrections, and the Parole Board don't impact what happens to individual people. We've heard a few stories of people being told by DOC, go to Aladrew. That's enough for you. They go up for a parole vote. The parole board says, you know what? I want you to go to RSAT too. And they have to circle back and do that. We would like to suggest that the parole board and the DOC agree in advance to a treatment matrix, not about a particular person, but about a strategy for treating people. And that agreement in advance be a driver that ends any disagreements of the nature that I just described. In your paper, this would be policy option 2A, right? And this is post-release supervision. This is ending the max outs, and it's a two-part policy. I'd like to focus you on the underneath the dotted line there on that orange box that says 6. That means year 6. So this is a hypothetical 10-year sentence. Right now, day for day good time, person earns all the good time they're expected to get, and they discharge that sentence in 5 years. They walk out, no supervision, right? So the idea here is to take people who have committed a violent offense and tack on supervision time. So some of their good time would essentially get traded back in for a year of supervision. So this would be a change that legally would have to apply prospectively for offenses committed after the effective date of the legislation, because this increases slightly the quantum of punishment that people experience, so you can't apply it retroactively. In contrast, for nonviolent offenders, and this is where we get savings, we propose to impose a period of supervision, 6 months supervision, leading up to that discharge date, instead of waiting until the discharge date and tacking it on as we would for violent offenders. In the case of nonviolent, we propose to essentially push them out of the system onto supervision 6 months before they reach that discharge date, if they haven't been paroled already. That measure creates quite a bit of savings. It's 300 to 400 people, beds a year, as we'll see in a later slide. So this is a major policy from a bed savings standpoint, but it's also a major policy from a public safety standpoint. We think it's troubling here and in other places when we see people coming out of prison with no supervision whatsoever. So we really want to try to hit that hard. The shorthand for this is graduated sanctions. Right now, when someone gets revoked from parole, they're spending an average of 1.7 years in prison. From probation to 2 years. So you're eating up a lot of space with people that have failed the supervision system. And we know that you all are doing a good job and trying hard in probation and parole not to just, lower the boom on people and send them to prison first time they show up with a dirty urine or whatever. We don't want the current use of patience and motivational interviewing and whatever else you're doing. We don't want to change that, but we do want to have the first instance of a revocation event to be a more limited instance of confinement. So the proposal is to have a 30 to 60 day, and that allows for some time credit. So 30 days could be the limit for somebody on the first instance of revocation, in lieu of revocation. And then in the second instance, 60 to 120 days. And then the third instance, if there has to be a third instance, the person, if they have time left on their sentence, that after the credit for those previous events, they would be sent back and serve out whatever the remainder is of that 2 years, for example, in the parole context. For people that don't have much time hanging over their heads, it can't be about the threat of reincarceration. It's got to be about supervision and connecting people to services and treatment so that they can carry on with their lives and not reoffend. We propose, and this is something that that you all are going to want to debate, I think, but we propose that because in the parole instance, I think it's pretty clear now and in the future that that's a state responsibility financially. In the probation instance, the way I understand it works now, someone comes into jail on a motion to revoke, or this would be for community corrections as well. And tell me if I'm wrong, Chris. They come in on a motion to revoke, things happen, they get revoked, you fill out some paperwork, and the minute you do that, they become a state responsibility. Well, our thought was that because the state corrections agency is getting sort of the benefit of this intermediate sanction, essentially, that it ought to be that agency's financial responsibility. And I think that's, you know, we don't want to benefit the state at the cost of counties, at the expense of counties. So that's a tricky issue, but that's how we come down on it. And I think you can kind of argue it either way, and perhaps it will be argued, but that's where we come down. Okay, this slide has a whole bunch of different points on it, and I'm going to take a minute to talk through it. The last bullet is important, and I want to bring it out right away for if nothing else, for the benefit of the parole board chairman, that we really agree that we've got to get to this issue of providing treatment and programs in the regional jails. I know there, as I said, that there are some obstacles to getting that done, but certainly at the current time, when you've got so many people backlogged in your system, and that's causing this vicious cycle of jail crowding, where you've got people in the wrong place, so you can't get the paperwork done, you can't get the programs done, you can't get them eligible in the parole board's eyes. You've got to do something about that, and I think that y'all are already starting to think through how to do that, but we would like to make sure that that happens. Going back up to the first bullet here, you have a statute on the books, I think it's 6212-7A, that requires or that allows the sentencing authorities to send someone off to prison to decide if they belong in prison, to do a sort of diagnostic process and decide if someone belongs in prison. We would like to see that much more limited, so that that's not an option. It doesn't look like it happens too much, but it happens to the tune of 20 beds a year, and that's a small benefit, but one that we think you should avail yourselves of, particularly as we move into an era where there's going to be better risk assessment at the front end of the system, which we'll talk about in a minute. We think that the need for this option will dwindle away. Next, I want to focus on screening people at the front end of the system, getting up to this diagram at the top. We've talked about this a little bit. We suggest that, and this is the psych eval issue, that rather than having both a statutory and a practice of insisting on a psych eval on every single person that comes in, what we saw was that a great majority of people end up not having an indication that they need mental health services. Therefore, we're suggesting a triage process that would eliminate the need for a psych eval, a full-blown eval on a fair number of people, and that one aspect of perhaps an inefficiency in your system, so that more people are susceptible to a vote to be released. This third bullet, the middle bullet here, that refers to the middle circle up there, is something that the parole board, I think, is already poised at least to implement, and that is, instead of FCing people because they don't have a home plan, going ahead and interviewing those folks, going ahead and doing as much of the parole process as they can, even for people that don't have an FC, to increase the efficiency. And then the fourth bullet, we want to not only encourage, because anybody can encourage, but we want to invest a little bit of the funding, the smallest increment of funding that we're going to suggest, that it go to the DOC to staff a more concerted effort to develop home plans, to make connections with nonprofits that might be out there in the community or around the state, to do the legwork that needs to be done to chip away at this really difficult home plan problem that you all have been struggling with. And again, it's that vicious circle of people backed up in the jails that don't get things done that they need so that they can get paroled. So we want to help the DOC to prioritize alternatives and linkages to resources that will help people process more quickly and have more suitable home plans ultimately. We want to change the no's on this chart to yeses. And in fact, we want to change that parole yes to a better yes, because right now parole is using an inadequate risk assessment, and they're not really applying it very systematically, unless they've started since we got here. So we want there to be risk assessment all across the front end of your system. We want probation and parole to use risk assessment to actually structure the way that they do supervision. They have supervision standards to govern, in particular, the supervision of people with high risk, high needs. And finally, we are suggesting that the Regional Jail Authority work with us to have the capacity to do a pretrial screen, a very brief assessment that can be done early on, at that first juncture in the system. And for you county folks, Patty, this is where we really, and Vivian, this is where counties stand to have some real benefit from this package. And it's not just in doing the risk assessment, it's also in doing the kind of work that we've seen. Vivian, you referred me to Leonard, and we've talked about the work that's going on in a handful of counties, Jim Lee up in Brooke County, where they're just really paying attention to that pretrial population, and in fact to the whole population that the county's responsible for. Having some staff time devoted to that population has some real benefits. So we've seen the pretrial population, I think, go up 300 people almost in the last, from 2010 to 2011. That population is sort of vying with the jail backlog or the prison backlog in terms of who's using up the most space in your facilities. And with counties responsible, we really want to emphasize the use of a good instrument and the use of some elbow grease so that people are constantly bird dogging that population. Day report centers out there in your community corrections program. It's a great resource, 21 or so around the state, really nicely developed program that's come along in the last decade or so. We're concerned that day report centers are not sufficiently targeted for the right kinds of people and the right kinds of durations. So we want to put a little more rigor in the use of day report centers as well, and require that only people, only felons with the right kind of risk and needs as represented here end up getting serious resource allocation from day report centers. We don't think that you should have to give up the notion of using day report centers for misdemeanors, but we would like to target their use for more serious misdemeanors. So that's where the policy options come from. That is our thinking on the policy options here. We also heard about people being sent to day report centers for kind of a silly amount of time, 5 days, 10 days, 30 days, where nothing really could meaningfully happen. So we want to put some more structure around who goes and how long they stay, and how the day report center, which is doing the risk and needs assessment, how they apply that to individual offenders. I want to talk a little bit about, again, reaching across the silos within your system. We want to talk about a couple of different efforts. We think that there needs to be a committee. This could be the existing Community Corrections Committee, NORB, but having somebody oversee implementation of evidence-based practices across your system. I think you've been working on that, and we want to kind of reinforce that effort and give it some legislative impetus. We'd also like to require, Steve, for the Division of Probation in your office to form a new group that would work with us, but also without us, and in our absence, across systems, so that people who are supervised in the community on probation or community corrections, or ultimately on parole, that you're either using the same case management system, and I'm thinking of the case management system that you all are rolling out right now, or that at a minimum, as the DOC and parole system moves into a new era of electronic offender information, that we're able to share information across systems, so that everybody that works on offender supervision at the local level is literally working off the same page, knows the same information, knows what the risk need assessment looks like, and knows who they're dealing with. First of all, I'll remind you of the trajectory that you're on, and we've added in this green wedge to show you the $150 million in operational costs that continued growth represents. We've been told that there's also a $200 million at least correctional facility in your future unless something is done. So all told, $350 million in potential savings based on your very recent current projections. So instead of that upward growth, with some lag time, because these policies have to take effect and start actually affecting what happens to individual people as they cycle through the system. With that lag time built in, where you see the 75-31 there, that's where we think it sort of caps out and tops out, and the policy options start to really take effect. Now I'm going to show you the assumptions that we made in the policy options and the different the number of beds that are affected. So I want you to be thinking about those things as you mull over these policy options. So this is that bed impact by policy. Mandatory supervision, that's the 2A policy. Pretty big impact, 300 to 400 beds per year. Diagnostics, that's that one little statute that I mentioned. That's in 2C. Parole efficiencies is in 2C. And then, well, I'll stick with just those two. Those are smaller impact policies, but I want you to understand how we did the parole efficiencies. That's kind of bundling together the notion of the triaging of mental health assessments, the psych evals, the home, better efficiency, more success on getting home plans taken care of. Basically working with the parole board over time to help them transition to better use of risk and need assessment. We're basically assuming an 8 percentage point increase in the parole grant rate, just as a way of guesstimating the impact of a series of different policy options that we think will promote more efficiency in that system. Graduated sanctions, the fourth one down, that's 2B in the paper. Biggest impact policy on its own. This is the caps on revocation. And then treatment supervision, I alluded to early on. This is the 3A policy in the paper. We project that to kick in 2016, after there's been some time to build up treatment supervision capacity. So we didn't want to just say, oh yeah, that just starts next year. That would not work, and we want to be straight with you all about how these impacts go. Now, I think that treatment supervision, if it's done well and takes off, it could have a bigger impact in this, and that line that I showed you would start to flatten out and stay flat. I think that if we can really get West Virginia fired up and working on good connections with behavioral health and getting some treatment capacity out there in the communities, that this could be an overly conservative estimate in this chart. So total estimated savings out until the year 2018, almost $142 million. That's leaving off the table the $200 million for a new prison. And it's just based on average cost per inmate. This is an important summary of the impact of the policies, the savings that they generate, and where we propose to actually fund reinvestment, okay? So let's just look at 2014 and 2015, because 14 is kind of the build-up year, and 15 is the beginning of the full-blown reinvestment phase as we propose it. And again, this is our conservative suggestion for what quantity of money should be reinvested. You're saving $13.6 million in that first year, reinvesting $3.5 million. So it's the highest percentage there, 26% of the savings would be reinvested. I mentioned that we want to help the DOC with housing plan assistance. That's the $100,000. We imagine that would be a couple of staff people that would do nothing but work on that problem. Pretty good chunk of money, $400,000 a year in training and sustainability, carrying these changes forward, doing all the human resource development that you need to do, getting better at the data piece, all those things that require money and are frankly not very sexy sells for a legislature in my experience, and so we want to use this opportunity to make sure that there's resources to do those things. And then of course the big investment in community-based substance abuse treatment, building up from $3 million in the first year, $5 million in the second year, and in the out years. Ed would probably want me to mention that bullet that estimates are based on calendar year data. We'll have to make adjustments to convert to fiscal years for budgeting. That's for people that are smarter than me. And this, I think, is the last substantive slide. So I want you to take a minute to look at these assumptions. I've mentioned some of these along the way. So in general, we're assuming that the projections, which have been fairly accurate up till now, that your status quo projections are accurate, and that growth pattern is going to continue. For the mandatory supervision piece, I told you about the 6 months decrease in average length of stay for the nonviolent offenders. That's where you get the benefit. The diagnostics issue, this is the sending people to prison to see if they need to be in prison. That's only 20 beds or less a year, but we are not completely doing away with that option. I think there's the possibility in the law of particular very tricky offenses that are not high volume offenses that this would still be allowed for. The parole efficiencies, I described this. We anticipate an 8% increase in the parole grant rate based on a variety of changes in efficiencies. Graduated sanctions, 2B, the single biggest impact policy option. We made a number of assumptions that we think are conservative there, including making a discount for people that right now we see in the data coded as a technical, a second tier type violation rather than a commission of a new offense or absconding. So we want to make some adjustment for new offenses and for absconding. And I wasn't specific about that earlier. The graduated sanctions idea is not intended for people who have committed a new offense and are being charged with that. It's also not intended for someone who flees supervision. We recognize that those types of violations need to have a more severe response. And then finally, I talked about the treatment supervision delayed until 2016, and a very conservative assumption about how many people would get that sentencing option, which I think, I hope that you will see a higher number, a higher percentage in the out years. And I want to open it up for questions. I'm going to wait for the work group first, Angie, and then recognize you, Rob. If you want to take over, that's okay too, or if you want me to stay up here, I'm happy to.